97 Hells Angels stormed a hospital to protect a woman from her husband. What they did shocked everyone. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Hospital cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on Sarah Jenkins's bruised face. Each breath was a shallow, painful effort, her ribs protesting every slight movement. She lay in the sterile white bed, a stark contrast to the chaotic, violent world she had just escaped, if only temporarily. The doctors had confirmed 2 broken ribs, a concussion, and numerous contusions across her body, a grim testament to yet another one of Mark's outbursts. Mark, her husband, a man whose charm had once masked a terrifying temper, now barely bothered to hide the monster beneath the surface. For years, Sarah had endured a life dictated by his unpredictable rages, his possessive grip tightening with each passing season. She had learned to anticipate the signs, the subtle shifts in his mood, the escalating tension that inevitably culminated in a brutal physical assault. This time, however, was different. This time, she had fought back, not with physical force, but with a desperate, primal scream that had drawn the attention of a neighbor. The subsequent police intervention, though brief and ultimately ineffective in terms of long-term protection, had at least provided her with a temporary reprieve, a ride to the emergency room, and a brief moment of peace away from her tormentor. But peace was a fragile commodity in Sarah's life, always threatened by the looming shadow of Mark's inevitable return. She knew he would come for her. He always did. He saw her as his property, an extension of his own volatile ego, and any defiance, any attempt at escape, was met with swift and brutal retribution. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened whenever a shadow passed her door or a new nurse entered her room. She clutched the thin hospital blanket, her knuckles white, her eyes darting nervously towards the closed door, envisioning his silhouette appearing in the frame, his menacing smile heralding the end of her brief respite. The hospital, with all its sterile equipment and hushed efficiency, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room for her fate. Unbeknownst to Sarah, her brother, David Reaper Jenkins, a long-standing, respected, and fiercely loyal member of the local Hells Angels chapter, had been tirelessly searching for her. David had always been protective of his younger sister, but years of Mark's manipulative tactics and Sarah's own shame had driven a wedge between them. She had consistently downplayed the abuse, presenting a facade of domestic bliss, even as the bruises told a different story. David, however, was not easily fooled. He had always harbored suspicions about Mark, a man he instinctively disliked and mistrusted. When Sarah failed to answer his calls for 2 days, a gnawing dread began to set in. He knew her patterns, her routines, and this radio silence was alarming. He deployed his network, a vast web of contacts stretching across the city, to find her. It was a call from a beat cop, an old acquaintance who owed David a favor, that finally broke through the silence. The officer, recognizing Sarah's name from a recent domestic disturbance report, discreetly informed David that his sister had been admitted to St. Jude's after a severe beating. The details were sparse, but the implication was clear: Mark had escalated. The news hit David like a physical blow. His sister, his only surviving family, was in danger, and he had been powerless to protect her. A cold, righteous fury began to simmer within him, a dangerous emotion for a man like David, whose loyalty to his family was as unwavering as his commitment to his club. He knew Mark was a coward, a bully who preyed on the vulnerable. But he also knew Mark was cunning and relentless. David understood that the hospital, while offering immediate medical care, was not a long-term solution for Sarah's safety. Mark would find her. The police, with their bureaucratic limitations and legal constraints, would be unable to provide the decisive protection Sarah truly needed. David immediately knew what he had to do. His sister was in peril, and the traditional channels were insufficient. This was a matter for family, and in David's world, family extended far beyond blood. It encompassed the brotherhood of the Hells Angels. The call went out, not through official club channels at first, but through a rapid-fire series of personal calls and encrypted messages. David reached out to his closest confidants, the most trusted members of his chapter, men who had ridden beside him for decades, through thick and thin. He explained the situation with grim brevity: his sister, severely beaten, hospitalized, and still in danger from her abusive husband. The response was immediate and unequivocal. Loyalty was the bedrock of the Hells Angels, and protecting a member's family was a sacrosanct duty, a line that, once crossed by an outsider, invited severe and collective retribution. Word spread like wildfire through the interconnected network of the local chapters. The sheer injustice of a man repeatedly abusing a defenseless woman, especially the sister of a respected patch holder, ignited a collective outrage. Within hours, the meeting point was established, a discreet, out-of-the-way parking lot on the outskirts of the city, usually reserved for industrial vehicles. Motorcycles began to arrive, first in trickles, then in a steady stream, their powerful engines rumbling a low, ominous chorus that resonated through the cool evening air. Chrome gleamed under the streetlights, reflecting the determined, hardened faces of the men who dismounted. Leather vests adorned with the iconic Death's Head patch, the symbols of their brotherhood and their unyielding resolve, were pulled tighter. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a sense of impending action. David stood at the center of the gathering, his face etched with a mix of worry and cold fury. He addressed the assembled men, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. He reiterated the facts, painting a grim picture of Sarah's vulnerability and Mark's predatory nature. He made it clear that their objective was not just to retrieve Sarah, but to ensure her absolute safety, to send an unmistakable message that such egregious acts against one of their own would never be tolerated. The numbers grew steadily. From David's own chapter, then from neighboring ones, men responded to the call. 97 Hell's Angels, a formidable assembly, stood ready. Each man understood the gravity of the situation, the potential repercussions of their collective action. Yet, there was no hesitation, no dissent. Their code was clear, family first, and an attack on a member's family was an attack on the club itself. The plan was simple in its objective, but complex in its execution: storm the hospital, locate Sarah, and ensure her safe extraction, while simultaneously dealing with the threat posed by Mark. The sheer audacity of the plan, the scale of the impending intervention, was unprecedented, even for a group known for its audacious displays of power and solidarity. But the feeling was that the situation demanded nothing less. This was not merely about justice, it was about a fundamental principle of protection and retribution. As the convoy of 97 motorcycles roared to life, the collective sound was a thunderous declaration, shaking the very foundations of the quiet industrial park. It was a sound that spoke of power, unity, and an unyielding purpose. The procession moved through the late-night streets, a formidable, intimidating spectacle. Motorists pulled over, pedestrians stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension as the column of roaring machines, each carrying a leather-clad rider, swept past. The destination was St. Jude's Hospital, a beacon of healing that was about to become the epicenter of an extraordinary confrontation. The hospital, typically a place of hushed urgency and controlled chaos, was operating under its usual late-night rhythm. A few emergency vehicles dotted the ambulance bay, the front entrance lit by a soft, welcoming glow. Inside, nurses charted, doctors made their rounds, and patients slept, oblivious to the seismic shift about to occur just outside their walls. Sarah, still restless in her bed, occasionally flinched at distant sirens, but she had no idea the cavalry was literally on its way. Then, the distant rumble began. Faint at first, an almost imperceptible vibration in the air, it quickly grew into a resonant, unmistakable roar. It was not the sound of a single vehicle, nor even a small group. This was a symphony of engines, powerful and relentless, approaching with an unstoppable momentum. The first few motorcycles peeled off the main road, turning into the hospital's main driveway, followed by dozens more, then what seemed like an endless stream. The sheer volume of their arrival was overwhelming. 97 motorcycles, each a gleaming beast of chrome and steel, pulled up to the hospital entrance, filling every available parking space, spilling over onto the lawns, their engines finally cutting out in a staggered, echoing silence that was almost more deafening than their approach. The sudden quiet was punctuated only by the heavy thud of boots on asphalt and the rustle of leather. Hospital security guards, initially bewildered by the unexpected influx, quickly moved from confusion to alarm. Their radios crackled with frantic calls for backup, but it was clear that any conventional response would be woefully inadequate. This was not a handful of unruly visitors, this was an organized, disciplined force. The sight of 97 heavily built men, clad in their distinctive club colors, converging on the hospital entrance sent a collective shiver through the staff and any onlookers. Faces peered from behind blinds, cell phones were discreetly raised, capturing the surreal scene unfolding before them. The air grew thick with anticipation, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone present. The Hells Angels, led by David Rupert Jenkins, dismounted with a practiced ease, their movements precise and coordinated. There was no shouting, no immediate aggression, just a unified, silent advance towards the automatic glass doors of the hospital. Their presence alone was a statement, a clear and unambiguous declaration of intent. The sheer number, the iconic patches, the reputation that preceded them, it all combined to create an aura of formidable power that instantly paralyzed the casual observer. This was not a spontaneous riot, it was a deliberate, calculated maneuver, executed with the terrifying efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The quiet hum of the hospital's interior was about to be shattered. The automatic doors hissed open, offering no resistance to the determined advance. The first few men stepped into the hushed sanctity of the hospital lobby, their heavy boots a stark contrast to the usual soft tread of medical personnel. Behind them, the remaining 95 followed, a silent, relentless tide of leather and denim. The air inside, sterile and clinical, suddenly felt charged, heavy with an unspoken threat. The few security guards present, two middle-aged men with weary eyes, stared in a mixture of disbelief and growing terror. Their initial attempts to block the entrance were pathetic, almost comical, against the sheer mass of men. One guard, a younger, more hot-headed individual, instinctively reached for his radio, but a burly Hell's Angel, his face impassive, simply placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that conveyed both a warning and an undeniable power. The guard froze, his eyes wide, the radio dropping uselessly to his side. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The message was clear, resistance was futile, and potentially dangerous. The sheer volume of the Hells Angels' presence instantly shattered the hospital's carefully maintained calm. A lone nurse at the reception desk, her head buried in paperwork, looked up, her eyes widening in horror as the lobby filled with the imposing figures. Her gasp was the first sound of panic, quickly followed by the hushed whispers and terrified murmurs from the few visitors and patients waiting in the area. A child, clutching a teddy bear, began to cry, his wails echoing eerily in the sudden, suffocating silence. David Rupert Jenkins, his eyes scanning the directory board, moved with purpose, a silent general leading his army. He didn't need to shout orders, his men understood. They fanned out, securing the main entrances and exits, their mere presence an unbreachable barrier. Others began to move down the main corridors, their heavy steps shaking the floor, their gazes sweeping over every door, every face. The hospital, designed to be a place of healing, transformed into a fortress under siege. Panic rippled through the facility. Doctors and nurses, alerted by the sudden influx of heavily armed men, emerged from examination rooms and offices, their faces a mixture of confusion and abject fear. A code-white security threat was quietly broadcast over the internal PA system, but it felt like a whisper against a hurricane. Many staff members, trained for medical emergencies, found themselves utterly unprepared for this kind of invasion. Some retreated into offices, locking doors, while others, driven by a professional duty or sheer adrenaline, tried to understand what was happening, only to be met by the unyielding stares of men who clearly meant business. The Hells Angels, however, were not here to cause indiscriminate harm. Their focus was singular, their discipline absolute. They moved with a predatory efficiency, their eyes searching, their movements coordinated. David found an information desk, abandoned by a terrified clerk, and quickly located the patient directory. His eyes darted down the list until he found her name, Jenkins, Sarah. Room 312. Third floor. Without a word, he turned and headed towards the elevators, a phalanx of his most trusted men falling in behind him. The rest of the club maintained their positions, controlling the ground floor, ensuring no one entered or left without their knowledge, effectively isolating the hospital from the outside world. The few patients who were mobile enough to witness the scene stared in horrified fascination, unable to comprehend the scale of the event unfolding before them. On the third floor, Sarah Jenkins lay awake, her fear a constant, gnawing presence. She had been drifting in and out of sleep, each waking moment a fresh wave of anxiety about Mark's inevitable return. Then, she heard it. A distant, growing commotion. Not the usual hospital sounds, but a deeper, more insistent thrum, followed by the muffled shouts and hurried footsteps. Her heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her bruised ribs. Was it Mark? Had he found her already? A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She pulled the thin blanket tighter, her body trembling. The elevator doors on the third floor chimed open, and David stepped out, his gaze unwavering. He immediately spotted room 312. Two nurses, visibly shaken, were trying to attend to a patient in an adjacent room, their movements clumsy with fear. They froze, their eyes widening as David and his men approached. David ignored them, his focus entirely on his sister's door. He pushed it open gently, stepping inside. Sarah gasped, her eyes flying open. She saw a silhouette framed in the doorway, a large, imposing figure. Her breath hitched, a scream catching in her throat, convinced it was Mark. But then, the figure stepped fully into the light, and her eyes, still clouded with fear, slowly recognized the familiar, stern face. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief washing over her. David Rupert Jenkins stood by her bedside, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. His face, usually a mask of hardened indifference, softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at his sister's bruised and battered face. The sight of her, so frail and vulnerable, reignited the cold fire of rage within him. "Sarah," he rumbled, his voice thick with emotion he rarely displayed. "I'm here. We're getting you out of here." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, a torrent of relief after years of suppressed fear and pain. How did you find me?" she choked out, still struggling to comprehend the scene. She could hear the distinct sounds of many men outside her room, the low murmur of voices, the heavy thud of boots. "Doesn't matter now," David said, his gaze hardening as he surveyed the room, as if expecting Mark to materialize from the shadows. "What matters is you're safe now. We're taking you home." Just as David spoke, a commotion erupted further down the corridor. A male voice, loud and aggressive, cut through the tense silence. "Where is she? I know she's here. You can't keep her from me." It was Mark. He had arrived. The sound of his voice sent a fresh wave of terror through Sarah, her momentary relief evaporating. She shrank back into her pillows, her eyes wide with dread. David's head snapped towards the sound, his jaw clenching. He had anticipated this. Mark, driven by his possessive rage, was as predictable as he was dangerous. David turned to one of his men, a burly individual named Hammer, who had followed him into the room. "Stay with her. Get her ready to move. Nobody touches her." Hammer nodded, his hand instinctively going to the large knife sheathed at his hip, a silent promise of protection. David stepped out of the room, his eyes blazing with a cold fury that promised retribution. He saw Mark, a disheveled, furious figure, being tentatively restrained by two terrified hospital orderlies. Mark was shouting, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and drunken desperation. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to walk into a hospital lobby teeming with Hell's Angels. He had expected a quiet, easy retrieval of his property. The moment Mark saw David, his eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear replacing his bluster. He knew David. He knew what David was capable of. The orderlies, sensing the shift in dynamics, cautiously stepped back, leaving Mark exposed. David walked towards him, his strides deliberate, each step echoing with an unspoken threat. The other Hell's Angels in the corridor formed a silent, menacing semicircle, effectively cutting off any escape. "Mark," David's voice was low, dangerous, a growl that promised pain. "You shouldn't have come here." Mark tried to regain his composure, a desperate attempt to appear strong. "She's my wife. You can't just take her. This is kidnapping," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around, searching for an exit, for help, for anything. But there was no help coming. The hospital staff had retreated, and the few police officers who had initially responded to the security threat call were still outside, overwhelmed by the sheer number of motorcycles and the organized chaos. They were calling for backup, waiting for a tactical response, unwilling to charge headlong into a situation involving nearly 100 Hell's Angels. "Your wife?" David scoffed, a dark laugh escaping his lips. "You beat her within an inch of her life, you piece of trash. She's my sister. And you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Mark finally understood the gravity of his situation. The fear in his eyes was no longer a flicker, it was a raging inferno. He tried to back away, but the wall of leather-clad men was impenetrable. He was trapped. David raised a hand, and two Hell's Angels stepped forward, grabbing Mark by the arms, their grips like steel vices. Mark struggled, but his efforts were pathetic against their combined strength. Meanwhile, a stern-faced doctor, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a woman of formidable will and unwavering professional ethics, emerged from an office, her voice firm despite the chaos. "What is going on here? You cannot just come in here and assault patients. This is a hospital, not a battlefield." She saw the men holding Mark, and then her eyes fell on David. "You! Release that man immediately. And you cannot remove a patient against medical advice." David turned his gaze towards her, his expression unyielding. "This man is a coward who nearly killed my sister. And my sister is leaving. Now." He gestured towards Sarah's room. Hammer, with the help of another angel, was already helping Sarah sit up, carefully supporting her injured ribs. She was pale, but a new resolve was beginning to surface in her eyes, fueled by the presence of her brother and the overwhelming show of force. Dr. Vance, despite her fear, stood her ground. "She is in no condition to be moved. She has 2 broken ribs, a concussion, and internal bruising. It could be life-threatening." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "And staying here, waiting for him to finish the job, is a better option?" David retorted, his voice laced with venom, gesturing towards the struggling Mark. "We have our own medics. She will be taken care of." He stepped towards Dr. Vance, his towering presence forcing her to instinctively take a step back. "Understand this, doctor. We are not asking. We are taking her. And anyone who tries to stop us will regret it." His words were not a threat, they were a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. Just then, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, closer. The police were finally making their move. The initial units, realizing the scale of the operation, had called for every available officer, including SWAT and tactical units. The hospital, now a scene of a full-blown siege, was about to become a confrontation zone. The Hell's Angels outside, acting as perimeter security, were already reporting the approaching sirens through their internal communication. David heard the sirens, a grim smile touching his lips. He had expected this too. He turned back to Mark, who was still struggling, his face a mask of terror and impotent rage. "Take him downstairs," David ordered the 2 men holding Mark. "He's going to be a message." The implication was clear, chilling. Mark's struggles intensified, a desperate whimper escaping his lips as he was dragged away, his pleas for help ignored by the terrified hospital staff. Hammer and the other angel carefully helped Sarah out of her bed. She winced in pain with every movement, but her eyes were fixed on David, a silent plea for protection, and a dawning understanding of the extreme measures being taken for her. She knew, deep down, that this was her only chance. The hospital could not protect her from Mark, and the law had consistently failed. Her brother, and his formidable brotherhood, were her last resort. As Sarah, supported by 2 Hell's Angels, slowly made her way out of the room, the other members of David's chapter cleared a path, their faces grim, their eyes scanning for any new threats. The atmosphere was thick with impending confrontation. The sirens were now deafening, and the flashing blue and red lights of numerous police vehicles began to illuminate the hospital parking lot. This was no longer just about retrieving a sister, it was a full-scale standoff. The Hell's Angels, 97 strong, were making their exit, and they would not be deterred. Their bikes, a powerful, chrome-plated army, waited outside. The real challenge, however, was not getting into the hospital, but getting out with Sarah, and ensuring Mark's message was delivered. The conflict was far from over, it was just beginning to boil. The hospital entrance, once a sterile gateway to healing, was now a maelstrom of flashing lights and urgent commands. Dozens of police cruisers, SWAT vans, and tactical response vehicles had converged, forming an impenetrable perimeter around St. Jude's. Officers, clad in riot gear, with shields and rifles, were fanning out, their laser sights dancing across the hospital's facade. The air thrummed with the whine of police radios and the shouted orders of commanders. Inside, the Hells Angels, 97 strong, held their positions. They were an island of calm in a sea of escalating chaos. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene outside, yet their discipline was absolute. No one panicked, no one broke rank. David Rupert Jenkins, having delivered his chilling order regarding Mark, turned his full attention to Sarah. "Hammer, is she ready?" David's voice was low, cutting through the distant sirens and the internal hum of the hospital. Hammer nodded, his large hands gently supporting Sarah as she slowly, painfully, swung her legs off the bed. Her face was pale, a mixture of pain and a fragile hope. The other angel draped a thick, dark leather jacket over her shoulders, a symbolic gesture of protection and belonging. "We need to move quickly," David stated, his eyes flicking towards the window, where the first snipers were taking positions on adjacent rooftops. "The longer we stay, the harder this gets." Dr. Vance, still defiant despite the overwhelming odds, stepped towards David. "I cannot allow this. You are endangering this woman's life by moving her. And you are creating a hostage situation." Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was clear. David stopped, turning to face her fully. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "Doctor, we are not creating a hostage situation. We are ending one. For years, my sister has been a hostage in her own home, in her own life. The law couldn't protect her. This hospital couldn't protect her. We will." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "And as for her condition, our medics are more than capable. She will receive the best care, carefree from the fear of her tormentor returning." He then spoke with a chilling finality. "Anyone who obstructs her safe passage will be considered an accomplice to her abuse. Make your choice, Doctor." Dr. Vance, confronted by the sheer force of his conviction and the implicit threat, hesitated, then slowly stepped back, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She knew she was powerless against such a determined force. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mark was being dragged through the service corridors, away from the public eye. His desperate pleas and curses were muffled by the thick walls. Two Hell's Angels, their faces impassive, held him firmly, ignoring his struggles. They led him to a secluded area near the loading docks, where a single, unadorned van, not part of the motorcycle convoy, waited. Inside, two more angels, known for their persuasive methods, awaited. Mark's eyes widened with pure terror as he was shoved into the van. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that his message would be delivered far from the flashing lights and the watchful eyes of the police. The van's doors slammed shut, and it sped away, merging seamlessly into the late-night traffic before the police perimeter was fully solidified, its departure unnoticed amidst the larger spectacle. Mark's fate was sealed, not by a public execution, but by a chillingly private reckoning, ensuring he would never again pose a threat to Sarah. Back inside, David gave a signal, and the Hell's Angels began to consolidate, forming a tight, disciplined formation. Sarah, supported by Hammer and another brother, was brought down to the ground floor, her face a mask of pain and dawning relief. The sight of her, a frail woman amidst a phalanx of hardened bikers, was a stark image for the remaining hospital staff and the few trapped visitors. As they approached the main entrance, the police commander's voice boomed through a megaphone from outside. "This is the police. Lay down your weapons and exit the building with your hands up. Any delay will be met with force." David stepped forward, reaching the automatic doors, which hissed open to reveal the blinding array of police lights. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but in a gesture of calm authority. "We are not here to fight," David projected, his voice surprisingly clear and resonant, carrying over the static of the megaphone. "We came for my sister. She is safe now. We are leaving." He gestured towards Sarah, who was slowly being brought into view. We will not engage, provided you do not engage us. Let us pass, and this ends peacefully. The police commander, Captain Miller, a seasoned veteran, hesitated. He had seen enough to know that a direct assault on 97 organized, determined men, especially with a civilian potentially caught in the crossfire, would be a bloodbath. The optics alone would be disastrous, regardless of who was right. Furthermore, the sight of the bruised woman, clearly distressed, subtly shifted the narrative. Public sympathy, he knew, could easily swing against the police if they were seen as preventing a victim from leaving her abuser. Release the woman. Miller shouted back, trying to assert control, but his voice lacked conviction. She is not being held, David countered, his voice unwavering. She is being protected. She is coming with us. He paused, then added, her abusive husband, Mark, is no longer a threat. He will not be returning. The implication was clear, chilling, and understood by Miller. The captain knew the Hells Angels' reputation for dispensing their own brand of justice. He weighed his options, a massive, violent confrontation with potentially heavy casualties on both sides, or allowing them to leave, dealing with the aftermath later. He made his decision. All right. You will exit slowly, one at a time, no sudden movements. Anyone carrying a weapon will drop it immediately. David nodded, a subtle gesture of acceptance of the terms. He turned to his men. Form up. We ride out. The Hells Angels began to move, their disciplined formation shifting. 2 men led Sarah out, carefully guiding her towards a waiting, unmarked SUV that had miraculously appeared among the sea of motorcycles. The police, though maintaining their weapons at the ready, did not fire. The sheer spectacle of the bikers, their grim faces, their unwavering unity, was enough to deter immediate aggression. One by one, the Hells Angels mounted their bikes. The roar of 97 engines starting simultaneously was deafening, a defiant symphony that vibrated through the ground. Sarah was gently tucked into the back of the SUV, surrounded by angels, away from the flashing lights and the tense standoff. David was the last to mount his bike. He looked back at the hospital, then at Captain Miller, a silent, knowing stare that conveyed both a warning and a resolution. Then, with a final roar, the convoy of motorcycles, with the SUV in its midst, pulled out of the hospital parking lot, leaving behind a bewildered police force and a hospital forever changed by the night's events. The Hells Angels did not disappear into the night. They rode together, a unified force, until they reached a secluded compound, far from the city. Sarah was immediately seen by their own experienced medic, a former combat doctor who had found his place within the club. Her injuries were carefully assessed, her pain managed. She was given a private room, clean and comfortable, a sanctuary she had yearned for years. David stayed by her side, a silent, watchful presence. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt truly safe. The fear, a cold knot that had resided in her stomach for so long, began to loosen its grip. Over the next few days and weeks, Sarah slowly healed, both physically and emotionally. The Hells Angels, true to their code, provided her with unwavering support and protection. She was given a new identity, a new life, far away from the shadow of Mark. They helped her find a small, quiet place to live, ensured she had financial security, and provided a network of discreet surveillance to ensure Mark, or anyone connected to him, could never find her. She started fresh, able to breathe freely, to walk without flinching, to live without constant terror. She began to volunteer at a local animal shelter, finding solace in caring for creatures who, like her, had known fear and neglect. Her bond with David, once strained, was now stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of that terrifying night. He visited her often, his stern face softening as he saw her slow but steady transformation. As for Mark, the message delivered by the Hells Angels was indeed chillingly effective. He was found days later, severely beaten, left in a remote location, far from any help. His body bore the unmistakable marks of a brutal, prolonged assault. His legs were broken in multiple places, his hands crushed, his vocal cords severely damaged, ensuring he would never again raise his voice in anger or lay a hand on anyone. He was left with enough life to suffer, but not enough to ever be a threat. The police investigation into his assault went nowhere, no witnesses, no leads, just the grim understanding among law enforcement that he had crossed the wrong people. Mark spent the rest of his life confined to a wheelchair, a broken, mute shadow of his former self, a living testament to the consequences of his cruelty. He was utterly powerless, stripped of his ability to inflict harm, his rage now turned inward, consuming him from within. The Hells Angels faced intense scrutiny from the authorities. The incident at St. Jude's Hospital became a national sensation, a viral story that polarized public opinion. Some condemned their actions as a blatant disregard for the law and a dangerous display of vigilantism. Others, however, hailed them as heroes, celebrating their decisive intervention in a case where the system had failed a victim of domestic abuse. Captain Miller, facing immense pressure, was forced to launch a full-scale investigation. However, with no direct confrontation, no shots fired, and no formal charges laid by the hospital, who, after the initial shock, were surprisingly reluctant to press charges, perhaps understanding the unique circumstances, the case became a bureaucratic nightmare. The Hells Angels, with their disciplined exit, had left no easy legal hooks. While they remained under surveillance, no mass arrests were made, and no one was ever directly charged for the hospital invasion. The club's reputation, already formidable, grew even stronger among its members and those who understood their code. David "Reaper" Jenkins remained a respected and powerful figure within the Hells Angels, his actions solidifying his standing as a man who would protect his family, no matter the cost. Sarah Jenkins, now living under a new name, occasionally saw the news reports about the St. Jude's Hospital incident, a distant echo of her past. She knew the truth, the depth of her brother's love and the extreme lengths his brotherhood had gone to save her. She found peace in her new life, a quiet strength emerging from the ashes of her old one. She never forgot the price paid for her freedom, and she cherished every moment of it. The Hells Angels had stormed a hospital, defied the law, and shocked everyone, not just with their audacity, but with the unwavering loyalty that had, against all odds, saved a woman's life and freed her from a living hell. Her story became a legend whispered in the shadows, a testament to a different kind of justice, delivered by those who lived by their own code.